It's 1 week after Easter. It's 1 week after Jesus got up and walked out of the tomb. 1 week after God proved that even death does not have the last word over love. 1 week after the greatest miracle that ever happened. And yet, 1 week after, the followers of Jesus are still sheltering in place. They're spending all their time inside four walls. They're afraid to go out, except for the most basic necessities. Sound familiar? What our gospel story tells us this morning is that despite all of our alleluias on Easter morning, despite all the glorious music and fancy clothes and Sunday dinners, despite all the ways we usually celebrate on Easter Day that the Lord is risen, Easter is not an all-at-once thing. Easter is a process. Our calendar shows us this actually, although few of us are aware of it or what it means. It's usually displayed as a circle of 52 weeks, tying the end of the year together with the beginning, so that it's clear that God's time is endless, and every ending is also a beginning. Easter is marked with a cross, and before Easter are 6 weeks of preparation, Lent, colored purple. But what's interesting is that after Easter are 6 equal weeks of white. The entire 6 weeks of preparation during Lent is balanced by an entire 6 weeks after Easter. And this is important because Easter isn't an all-at-once thing. Easter is a process. Jesus doesn't rise from the dead, so everything's okay now. Easter is not a light switch that just turns off the darkness. Like any other monumental change, learning how to live into the reality of Easter takes time. It takes time and wondering and even disbelief. Which brings us to Thomas this morning. I love Thomas, and I think Thomas gets a bad rap. He's often cast as the one we shouldn't be like, the doubter. Jesus' words at the end of the gospel reading, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed," tend to be viewed as some sort of morality lesson, a criticism of Thomas, and a way for us to pat ourselves on the back for being more faithful than he was. After all, none of us got to see the risen Jesus in the flesh. But this year is different. This year, we are all Thomas. We didn't get our Easter hour in church with Jesus. Like Thomas getting the word from the other disciples, we got our Easter sort of secondhand, from our couches through our computer screens. And as wonderful a job as all of our clergy and staff and churches are doing to keep us all connected, and as amazing as it is that we even have the technology and the ability to do this, it's important to name that it's not the same. As Thomas would tell you, it's not the same as being in the room where it happens. We're not told why Thomas wasn't there the first time Jesus appeared. It's likely he was the one who volunteered or was picked to cover his face and sneak out for word on the street about whether or not it was safe to come out. Or maybe don a mask and head to the market for food for everyone. One thing is clear though. When Jesus first appears, walking through locked doors, all the disciples are hiding indoors except Thomas. And all those disciples continue hiding, even after they've seen Jesus, even after he's breathed his peace on them, even after they've gotten the Holy Spirit. A week after all that, they are still locked inside. Because Easter is a process. Now, all these followers of Jesus will eventually stand on street corners and preach to angry crowds about him. as we hear in the first lesson from our readings this morning. And they will travel far and wide to spread his message, and they will somehow become willing to die the horrible deaths that inevitably result from 12 rather ordinary Jewish men daring to challenge both Jewish and Roman authority. Andrew, crucified. Peter, crucified upside down. Philip, executed by Rome. James, stoned. Matthew, Simon, and Bartholomew, all martyred. Matthias, burned to death. And Thomas, who founded Christian sects in India, stabbed to death by Roman soldiers. How did they get there? How did they dare to leave their locked room and go out into the streets where every person was a potential threat? How do we walk into the grocery store and not see every person within 6 feet of us as a threat? How do we see death all around us and still be Easter people? Thomas shows us. First, by being honest. Because as much as we proclaim the resurrection and we proclaim our faith in God, truthfully, I find it hard to maintain the conviction that life wins when I watch the U.S. death toll reach number 1 in the world. When I know that although Jesus came back, if my own loved ones die, I'm unlikely to see them again here on earth. That's scary. It hurts just to think about it. And what Thomas shows us this morning is that we can take all of that to God, and it is not some sort of failing. Because God never asks us to pretend or put on a brave face. Thomas has the courage to be honest, to stand there and say, this is all just a bit too much. And the beauty of this story is that Jesus meets Thomas exactly where he is and gives him what he needs. Because that's what God does. Part of the process of Easter is being honest with God about where we are so that God can give us what we need. And the second thing that Thomas shows us this morning is that becoming Easter people is messy. A lot of people right now are talking about how important it is to appreciate the little things. Enjoy the beauty of spring, or time with your family, or a good book. And if that works for you and you can pull it off, great. Don't get me wrong. Gratitude is a very important spiritual practice, and it's absolutely necessary. But focusing on the positive in order to sidestep tragedy is not what Easter is about. As a priest I know once put it, on Easter morning we don't get up and say, oh, that's sad, but at least we have tulips to make us feel better. We wake up and say, the Lord is risen. And when Christ is risen, he's still wounded. One thing I've always found a little disturbing about this passage is how graphic it is. Even the description of Jesus' flogging and death have nothing on this passage, where Thomas is invited to literally stick his finger into the holes in Jesus' hand and side. Our gospel writer John is deliberately describing this interaction with Jesus in the grossest possible terms. Because the good news is not clean and simple and easy. Often Christianity seems to present this fairy tale narrative that life wins over death, things got really bad and scary, but in the end everything was okay, and Jesus died so we don't have to stare down death ever again. And that's just not true. The truth of being a follower of Jesus is that Easter means we do not hide from death. We do not distract ourselves from it with cat videos and bread baking and pretty sunsets. We do not turn away and say it is too hard or too scary or too messy or too sad. We lean in. We put our fingers into it. Because you cannot have a resurrection without the death that precedes it. So as followers of Jesus, we get close to it and we walk through death to the other side. That is what it means to be Easter people. That is what Thomas shows us. We say it in our baptismal vows. We do not turn away from death. We look for the resurrection of the dead. Not just in some distant future time, not just when a friend or a relative dies and we believe they go to heaven, but every day, right now, we look for where the resurrection is happening. And the looking closely, looking unflinchingly, Thomas shows us, is how we go from hiding inside to preaching on street corners. Cliff Strand looks. He's 50 years old, and he looks for people in homeless shelters and under bridges because that's where he was found 6 years ago. Cliff was a drug addict. He was ready to die when he was handed a basket of food by someone from White Pony Express, an organization that collects food from restaurants and grocery stores and delivers it to the needy. And today, Cliff is on the delivering end, helping to hand out 17,000 pounds of food a day in the midst of our worldwide lockdown. Not for a minute did I consider staying home during this outbreak, he said last week. I delivered food to the local shelter, and there's over 100 people in there. And they're my friends. I know these people. And now they're building a wall to prevent the virus from spreading, and it brought me to tears, he said. We were flashing up heart signs and saying, I love you through the wall, and I was crying, but it wasn't because there was fear. There's love going on in this whole thing, he said. There is love going on in this whole thing. Cliff Strand has a resurrection story. Cliff Strand is a resurrection story, and because of that, he sees love everywhere. He's an Easter person. And it is not easy. It is not simple. It takes the disciples weeks. It can take us years. Easter is a process, a dawning realization that edges its way into our consciousness and changes us from the inside into people who see love going on in this whole thing, who see the resurrection everywhere. Easter people. And the challenge those first followers of Jesus faced, the challenge we face today, is that in a world full of fear and death, most people are like Thomas. Most people find it very hard to believe that love wins. And so, like Jesus, it is our calling to show them. We are going to have to show our wounds. We are going to have to show our scars. We are going to have to live our own resurrection stories. We all have one. But that is how we witness to life over death. And in the process, become Easter people. Amen.